Gregory, please set the scene of what it was like in Seattle Public Schools during the years you were involved in the busing program.
Well, at the time, Seattle was what I would describe as a big hick town. And it kind of went dormant after the gold was extracted from Alaska, which kind of put Seattle on the map. And so, having said that, the port was sleepy. It was a few ships here and a few ships there. The downtown area uh, was known because of the Smith Tower, which is was the tallest building on the West Coast, west of the Mississippi. And the population here was uh, pretty much driven by the war industry coming out of World War II. And I was born in 1950. So I came about during a time when the economy was what they call the happy days, was booming because the major employer, Boeing Aircraft, was located here in Seattle. So, having said that, the population here was unlike a lot of major cities in that the people of color in this area were a smaller amount or percentage of the population than most major cities in the East Coast and California and the South. And so I'm pointing that out because the politics of integration and segregation became a little bit more manageable because of the relationship between a smaller amount of minorities and a larger group of whites. And at that time, there was a boom period that influenced everybody. And so dealing with social ills was a little more progressive from, I would say, from the general population in general. So the majority of the African American population traditionally had been occupying or living in the what they called the central area of Seattle, which was basically from Madison Street to Jackson Street. And then there were also public housing throughout the city in High Point and West Seattle, and there was the Renton Highlands, and there's Rainier Vista, Holly Park, and so there was a smaller amount of population of African Americans. Well, over the years, because of tradition and I guess racial-based policies, the schools in Seattle had been segregated, and the facilities as well as the books and all of the materials used to teach were hand-me-downs or in decay. And so at that time, there was a few progressive ministers, one to speak of Reverend John Adams, and as well as a community activist, John Hundley. He was Walter Hundley. He was very involved in upgrading the public schools in the central area, as well as opening up housing. Now, I was a youngster, about 12 years old, and my mom was an activist, and she would take me to various marches and rallies to address these problems of desegregation and the problems of inferior materials in schools and the restriction of housing for people of color in various areas of the city. So I became aware at an early age of how these problems came to exist. My family arrived here from Oklahoma by way of Chicago, and my mother, even further, she came from Georgia to Oklahoma and met my dad, and we came out here from Chicago. Well, my mom's background was she was what they call a preacher's kid, and 2 generations. My grandfather was a missionary as well as a minister. My grandfather on my dad's side was a farmer, and he held he was proud that he was the first African American person in his town to own a car. And I think my dad, that was the reason why my mom was attracted to him because he drove his father's car, and everybody else had horses and buggies. Well, we came out here following the shipping boom in a place called Vanport. And if you're not familiar with Vanport, you need to look into it because it was the Katrina before there was a Katrina. There was a city in between Washington and Oregon that was between Vancouver and Portland, and they called it Vanport, and it was walled in by a levee. And the city was built by Kaiser Shipping, who now was the father of the Kaiser Permanente medical system. And also they built a high school, and they built close to 18,000 houses in the Vanport area because the city of Portland couldn't accommodate the workers, and the workers were being paid equal, women, men, and people of color. And so Portland, having been the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan in the Northwest, wouldn't allow workers to rent housing in the area. Well, anyway, my uncle was a supervisor there, and he brought out my dad, who came out from Chicago. And my dad was a barber, and he had several businesses. And he opened up businesses in Eastern Washington, soda shop, a hotel, and a barber shop. And he was denied access to insurance on his property because he was the first person of color that was on Main Street, had a business on Main Street. And a lot of people resented that. And so he got threats, and eventually they set a gas station on fire next to his hotel. And my mom came out of the hotel with my older brother and sister in her arms, and the building collapsed. And he had integrated the hotel, and so he had about 40 people in the hotel at the time that it was destroyed. And he couldn't get insurance. He went to Spokane and finally got insurance, and then that was on Friday, and they burned down the hotel on Saturday. Well, I'm just saying that just to give you perspective of how my dad migrated to the Northwest, what his stops along the way were before he settled in Seattle. Well, we came to Seattle, and in order to buy a house, the banks wouldn't lend you money. And so my dad was selling used cars to African American sailors that were stationed in Bremerton as part of the Pacific Tour, or merchant seamen. And he became friends with a Chrysler dealership, the SL Salvage Company, and they gave him a car loan to buy our first house because Washington Mutual Bank wouldn't sell it to us. And so eventually, after my dad had he had four barbershops. And at that time, Jackson Street was the hub of the black business district. And during that time, he worked out of Edith's barbershop, then the Atlas barbershop next to the Atlas Theater in the International District, and then he eventually moved over to Madison Street on 22nd and Madison, in a location right next to the Birdland Ballroom, which is a famous entertainment area for those in the Northwest, black African Americans in the Northwest. And Quincy Jones and Ray Charles and the likes played at those facilities. So that gives you an idea. Between Madison and Jackson was the main hub of the central area housing for African Americans. Now, you couldn't go any further than 30th Avenue because that was lakefront. That included Madison Park, Madrona, Leschi, Mount Baker, and Seward Park. And those are exclusive areas for whites. So eventually, Boeing started hiring more and more people of color. There was a resistance initially, and then they opened up and started hiring a lot of machinists. And they brought in a lot of people from their plants from all over the country, from California and as far as Kansas City. And so that brought a lot of prosperity to the area, and it was basically a boom town as I was growing up. And so you can kind of get an idea of how the Vietnam War was starting to build up, and Seattle was the closest port to the Asia, and so there were a lot of soldiers and a lot of military equipment came through the SeaTac airport and the port of Seattle, and so it turned from a hick town to a cosmopolitan area that was soon to become international.
Gregory, how did you adjust to the bus ride as opposed to walking to the neighborhood school with friends?
Well, the schools that I went to initially in the central area, one in particular, Washington Middle School, my mom had fried some chicken for my lunch, and rats ate the chicken out of my locker. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how old and decrepit the buildings were. And you could step up the steps and step on the floor, and you could hear it creak all the way down to the other end of the building. And the elementary school I went to, they had secondhand books that they'd have a stamp in it, Green Lake Elementary or some northern school, North Seattle school that no blacks attended. And all the new books when they came out would go to the North End school, and we would get the hand-me-downs. There were some of the pages were torn out, and people would scribble all inside the books. So having said that, my mom wanted to get me to go to a school where I would get a proper education. And at the time, they decided to tear down the Washington Middle School. And, and so there was a program called the Voluntary Transfer Program that encouraged people of color to transfer out to various different schools in the area. And it was a kind of a new challenge for the city of Seattle, and because around the country there was busing taking place with violence and court orders, and Seattle was the first city in the country to not have a court-ordered integration program. And so I didn't want to go at first. I want to stay with my friends in the community, and but my mother insisted and said it would be a good thing for me. Well, taking the bus from the central area at that time was a journey. First of all buses had to go through downtown Seattle. You couldn't go north-south. You had to go east-west, and then you could hit your destination south or north. And which made it very, a long day for me. I was fortunate that my dad worked off of Madison Street, and I lived down off of Jackson, so I could stop at my dad's barbershop on the way home from school. But on the bus ride there, I met other students that were from various other parts of the central area, and they would join me on the bus ride, and we communicated some of the things that we observed about school in the North End, and going to a predominantly white middle school. One of the things, the school that I went to was Eckstein Middle School. And Eckstein at the time was the largest populated middle school west of the Mississippi. And that was due in part to the Sandpoint Naval Base that was in Lake Washington at the time. And people now, they don't remember that they had destroyers and destroyer escorts actually anchored in Lake Washington, and they finally stopped it because it was polluting the lake, and they were just too big to handle at that base. So they closed the base down, and a lot of the students at Eckstein were naval, come from naval families, but it was an odd mix because Sandpoint was one of the wealthier areas of the city, but yet they had a population of these Navy, what do you call it? They call Army brats or Navy kids or whatever, and they were various economic backgrounds from all over the country, and but they were mainly white. Well, when I went to Eckstein and transferred out, there was some things that stood out to me. One thing that I'll never forget is that I was in my what we used to call social studies, and we studied history as well. And President Kennedy was shot, and I had some character sat in front of me, and the teacher came in and said, "Class, I have to go to the office, and the president has been shot, and I have to get some more details, and I'll be back and just continue reading." And then as soon as she left out the door, this guy who sat in front of me said, "I'm glad that nigger lover's dead." And so, of course, we exchanged some words, and we ended up on the floor fighting each other. And the teacher came back in and broke it up and never reported any of this, just told us to just calm down, understanding that the tension in the air was very thick at the time. So, so that was one experience. Then there was another experience where
Do you want to turn it on, put it on silent?
Yeah, before you leave that scene, could you also talk about how you felt hearing that, like the emotions you had inside, and why you were so willing to fight to express yourself?
well,
Hold on just a second. Let's put this away. I'm picking that up, yeah. And let's make sure the phone is silenced.
I don't know how to silence these things.
Here, I can do it. Give it here.
I just turned the volume down.
No, but you could hear the buzzing. Give it here.
Yeah.
I'll turn it off. Or we'll throw it outside.
Okay.
We can put it on sleep. Do not disturb.
Okay, just turn it off completely. Put your password in.
Okay, I can.
Did you put your password in?
Yeah. Here.
Okay, so when it opens back up, then I can turn it off. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
And we'll pick back up with how you felt.
Okay. You had a question, or
Yeah, so that scene where you were willing to fight, talk about why. Like, what emotions were you feeling? Why were you willing to take that step of actually having to fight someone who called the president a nigger lover?
well,
Yeah, get to the mic.
I was one of maybe 12 people in a school of 1,200. And of course, I was raised in a Baptist and Methodist congregations as a child, and my mother was always an activist in the church, and she was on the African Relief Committee. She was also on the Open Housing Committee with Bishop John Adams from AME Church, and so I was taught at an early age about racism and about activism and being a humanitarian. And so I recognized the hatred in this kid right away. And it became, I guess I felt it was demeaning to me, and that I had to let other people know so they recognize not to do that or treat me that way. And so that's why we came to blows. And, and that wasn't the only instance. When the voting rights activists in the South were killed, and the teacher was going over that in class, there were some girls in the back that were laughing. And so I had words with them after class, and I, did my best to let them know that, how heartless they were, you know. So, and then a lot of times in every class I was in, if there's anything that had to do with civil rights or race relations or African American history, the teacher would ask the question and nobody knew the answer. except me. And so I was called upon, and the teacher used me pretty much to educate the rest of the class. So I would give the answers because I was taught about Adam Clayton Powell, excuse me, minister in the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, and congressman, and head of the Ways and Means Committee. And I knew those things. I would sit down with my dad on Sunday nights and watch Meet the Press with him. And we would go over the struggles with China and Russia, and the appropriations committees, and the presidential elections, and senatorial elections. And I a lot of that was above my head, but because my dad was willing to teach me, and it was time for us, a time for we could bond together outside of his barbershop. I enjoyed it immensely, and so I had these values, and I took those values with me when I went up to the North Seattle, to some of the schools, to the Eckstein experience out there. So I guess I was looking to be confronted with some of that stuff, and some of the things that happened out there as well was that there was parties and dances that we were invited to by the Sandpoint Country Club, and all the students were invited, regardless of whether you were a member of the country clubs or whatever. But they turned us away at the door. We couldn't go into any of the dances and stuff. So it was a unique experience for me at the time. And around that same time, the head of the Urban League, Edwin Pratt, was shot in his doorstep in Shoreline, Seattle, and he was the leading activist for open housing at the time. And so a lot of tension was going on in Seattle. A lot of change was taking place. Well, also the what they called the war on poverty was starting to kick in, and there was funding that Congress made available because of all the assassinations had really set the country back, and they were trying to heal some of the wounds, and so they passed this big war on poverty as part of a political deal or adjustment to the times. And so a community center called the Central Area Motivation Program, or the CAMP, was established. And from that camp, several programs for improving the housing stock in the central area, as well as making housing available outside of the central area for people of color, came about. Also addressing police brutality, and one of the areas where there's a high rate of police brutality was Garfield Playfield, right off of Cherry and Cherry Street. And so Walt Hundley and John Adams went back to D.C. and talked to Senator Warren Magnuson, and he talked to the head of the program, Sergeant Shriver, and money became available to various programs for youth and seniors and housing and education in the central area at the time.
Well, I think you've answered my next two questions, so I'll go to question number 5. Do you think that Seattle benefits from the voluntary desegregation of the schools, and why?
Well, as a participant, I think that there was, I carried a lot on my shoulders. Some of the other students carried a lot on their shoulders, but it was nothing compared to what people in the South and other parts of the country were going through. So we felt proud to take on some of the difficulties of interacting with youth of the other various parts of the city that weren't accustomed to being around people of color. Now, having said that, also, as I entered high school at Garfield High School, the population there was about 30% Asian, 30% Black, 30% white, and Latino. And the population at Garfield was such that everybody got along with each other. And there was a lot of multi-ethnic activities going on where we were educating everybody. And that carried on to a program that we started that would have students that would go to another school for a semester or a quarter, and we kind of how can I say we initiated what we call an exchange program, and we exchanged white students for people of color, and back and forth, and we kind of exported this racial harmony throughout the whole city of Seattle, and by showing them by example what we did at Garfield. And we had, Garfield was unique because we had a lot of kids that couldn't make it into O'Day or Prep, Seattle Prep, and they were, because they didn't have the income, and so they came to Garfield, and we had a lot of kids that were from what we called the Gold Coast, as I said earlier, Madison, Madrona, Leschi, Mount Baker, and Seward Park, and along the lakeside. And some of those kids would go to Garfield. And so there was a mixture of different cultures and economic backgrounds. And so we taught each other, and we bonded with each other, and we were known for that. And so that kind of changed the whole outlook of the city of Seattle. And when I first started in middle school, there's very few African Americans went to Roosevelt or Nathan Hale, which are northern schools, or Lincoln and Queen Anne and Ballard. Now, uniquely speaking, we had with Ballard in particular, I should say, we had a lot of confrontations, violent confrontations. I can remember one year when Ballard was ranked number 2 in the nation in their basketball program, and they had a 7-foot center and 2 big athletic players at forwards and guards. They were bigger than the University of Washington. Anyway, we had a team that had about, the tallest guy was 5'11", and we went out to Ballard and we beat them, and they were undefeated, and it was like nationwide, publicity, And so after the game, trying to get out of Ballard, several of my friends drove their parents' cars, and they were stoned, and windows were broken trying to get out of Ballard. So when they had the opposite home game at Garfield, they actually had to put a rope, one of those ropes that tie a ship to the harbor, down the middle of the gymnasium to keep black students to go out the back way and white students to go out to their buses. And they didn't allow white students to drive their cars. They provided school buses to take them back. Well, that didn't work because all the students lined up 23rd Avenue and pummeled the buses as they exited out of the area. But that gives you an idea of kind of what the tension was back in those days, and so I think that on the overall it was a good experience, and I think Seattle benefited from the voluntary busing program. Mm-hmm.
Did you feel stressed going to school? Because these kind of things with racism in the classroom seems like that could be a trigger. Did you feel like frustrated in the morning when you had to get on that bus and go north?
Initially, yes, I did. I didn't want to go. My mother had to promise me $15 to transfer out to the school, and which she never gave me, But she just said that to get me to go out to the school. But then I bonded with other students along the way, and we were able to share our experiences, and I was able to use that to understand what my role was in history, and my role was in the development of Seattle's public schools.
Yeah, it's been 60 plus years. I don't want to age you, but it's been 60-ish years.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think that we'd be further along as a country, as a community, especially here in Seattle? Can you face this way when you answer?
Well, that's an interesting question because my kids are addressing issues that my grandparents and my parents had to address, and then I had to address. And so I can see remnants of the same issues moving forward. I had a friend whose father was shot in the back. He was in the back seat of a car picking up Chinese food in Chinatown, and he didn't even go in the restaurant. He was sitting in the back seat of the car, and his two buddies went in to pick up the food to go, and there were two off-duty police officers with their wives in there, and they called them niggers and abusive words, and they didn't. They just responded like, that's not right, and that calmly addressing them. And then these off-duty police officers came out of the restaurant and shot into the car as it was driving away and killed one of my best friend's father, and shot him in the back of the head. And so those kind of things, they woke me up a lot, and there was a lot of tension as far as individual safety. But the development of the Seattle Black Panther Party, the first Panther Party outside the state of California, by the Dixon brothers, Aaron and Elmer, helped a lot of the tension and fear that we felt. We were able to address our manhood and our ability to protect ourselves through activities, free breakfast programs, sickle cell programs, voting registration, and the programs that they initially established in the city. And Mayor Wes Ullman was a a liberal mayor that allowed the Panther Party to exist and not be terrorized like in Philadelphia and in Chicago and Oakland and L.A. And so we were fortunate in that regard. We also had a very liberal board of directors for the Urban League here, and so a lot of work was progressive work was done. There was the Interfaith Council of all the various religions got together. Their leadership helped usher in a lot of legislation that helped address some of the ills at the time. So there were people stepping up. One thing, the Boynes actually went through a period when I went to college at UW. They laid off 40,000 people. So a lot of the leadership in the African American community was siphoned away and transferred to California or back to the Midwest, to Kansas City, to positions there where Boeing's operated different facilities. So, and they used to say when Boeing sneezes, the whole Washington State catches a cold, and that's the kind of the atmosphere it was in about 72, 73 when they started closing down some of the plants. But I thought that Seattle did a good job in addressing the race relations at the time, and the leadership stepped up, and eventually we elected a African American mayor, Norm Rice, and several members of the city council and county council, including Larry Gossett, and so I feel that if I was to raise a family, Seattle is where I would come to go raise it.
I had a couple of questions. Sorry. Just, you talked about, and this is just going to take you back a little bit, but you talked about how you got together with other friends who were bused to different places, and you would share about your observations of the white schools. Do you remember what any of those were, the observations or things that you talked about with those other students?
Well, it's funny that you asked that, because there were some situations which were only kids would do, and pranks and stuff. And one of the things was the some of the students, like I said, when the civil rights workers were killed, they laughed. And so some of the students that I traveled with on the bus, they decided to do something about that. So after school, they told these girls that the Beatles had died in a plane crash. And they were crying and moping and then so they kind of got back at them in a prankster kind of a way. But yeah, we observed how ignorant a lot of the students were as far as their knowledge of race and their knowledge of history, and of course we had to know that. We had to be aware of the conditions because, as I was taught at the time, that not only do you have to know about your culture and your history, and you have to know in your psychology, you have to know the same thing about white history and culture and psychology. So coming into that interface with student population, we had a little advantage because we had to know those things to survive.
And one more question just about the Vanport, and you mentioned that it was kind of Katrina before Katrina. What happened to Vanport?
Well, Vanport no longer exists. It was swept away. My dad had a brand new car, and everybody jumped out of their cars trying to escape Vanport to get back into Portland. And you had to go up a hill. And my dad, he wasn't going to leave his Buick. So he drove up on the levee sideways and got out of there. But my mom had already been in Portland with the kids, with my older brother and sister, visiting her sister. And so she was already out of there, but the levee broke. What happened at the time was that there was actually Vanport swelled up to, I think, something like 40,000 people. And well, when the war, after, the reason why it swelled up to 40,000 people was because when Pearl Harbor was attacked, we lost a bunch of ships there, and they had President Roosevelt initiated this plan to rebuild all those ships, and he didn't care how, he just wanted it done fast. He didn't care if you hired women, minorities, just pay them, get it done. And so after the initial shipments of ships came through, and the war was winding down, and the end of the war was in sight, most of the whites moved out of Vanport. So there was a core of about 18,000 people of color left there. And in Portland, which was the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan in the Northwest at the time, they didn't like that community. And so the levees mysteriously gave, and it wiped out all that whole area there. And a lot of those people were displaced and had to go to other states, California and Washington, and some of us hung around and stayed in Portland. But that's how we got up to Seattle.
So there was no storm. The levees just gave way.
Yeah. The Columbia River was right there, and I mean, you could, it's right there, Lake Pontchartrain, and and the Mississippi River. So it was unique. It's kind of a little buried part of history that people don't. Well, as you know, in the situation with Katrina, there was that had been going on for 50 years, where the Army Corps of Engineers was supposed to fix it, and they kept saying that, yeah, we're going to fix. Well, Louisiana was a Democratic state in the middle of all these conservatives, and so it never got done. And so when New Orleans elected a black mayor and 2 congressmen, and it became a kind of a liberal hub in there, there was resentment, and so they didn't address that problem of the potential of flooding the city. And I take it you've been to New Orleans.
I am a Texan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to thank each other for this interview and conversation?
Thank you, Gregory, for sharing your information about busing in Seattle.
Well, sure. I'm glad to provide it. One of the things that I don't want to do is die and not leave some of this information to be consumed or digested by the younger generations and other people that are unaware of the roots of Seattle.
Can I ask one more thing? I'm so sorry, this just occurred to me, but we talked to a different participant who just mentioned the way that he talked about busing in Seattle seemed very different than what you're talking about, and maybe were there two phases of busing, or so he went to Queen Anne's, and he said there was like a exchange of students from Franklin, but it seemed way more forced than what you're talking about, what you talked about. Was that just a different thing, or you're
Well, later, the initial program, the voluntary transfer program, that initiated the exchange of students from north and south and schools, and but later on, there became a more formalized lottery system where you got assigned particular schools, and you had to get exemptions if you wanted to stay in a neighborhood school. And but because the initial students that went through the voluntary program, the school district figured that it was a success and that they could get more students to participate. And so they planned other programs. And matter of fact, the other programs met some resistance because Ivers from Ivers Restaurant, he supported the school board and supported the programs. And some of the resistance came from anti-busing people who boycotted his restaurants. And so there was that tension later on when as they became more aggressive. Well, the other dynamic that was happening was that all that Gold Coast I talked about, they were moving over to Bellevue and Mercer Island and Kirkland and all the suburbs, and a lot of upscale black folks were moving into these nice homes along the lake, and so that dynamics was going. And then the Panther office was on 34th and Union, and that scared a lot of people from living in that area. And so the dynamics, the change of the city was happening at the time, the student population at the time. So there's different perspectives.